I just wanted to give a small background on what we are dealing with. Like somebody said, it's not a disease that is going to be cured tomorrow. We are looking at a long haul of impacts. And the emissions gap report last year noted that we are on the brink of missing the 1.5 target. The NDCs are not measuring up, and it says we need to work triple as hard on the NDCs to be able to achieve that, which is almost impossible. And the last 4 years have been the warmest on record. And we are seeing this in the impacts globally, presenting through increased warming, rainfall patterns, sea level rise. And all this comes with impacts in different forms: heat waves, floods, droughts, fires, and others. Next. Next slide, please. I wanted also to show some bit of figures. When we look at the global impacts, the science has proven that the impacts are not the same. The IPCC 1.5 report, for example, notes that the impacts of warming can increase gender and social inequality. And the IPCC 2014 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability also notes that climate change reinforces multidimensional inequality and vulnerability. And in all this, the impacts are highest on the poor, the most vulnerable countries, communities, poor women and men, boys and girls. And when we look at the statistics, we already see the different implications. 68% of all disasters are climate related. Over 300 billion losses have been made due to disasters. And we see 815 million people undernourished, which has been rising. We see 7 million deaths due to household and outdoor pollution, and a high number of women and children who are living in risky places, meaning that they're going to continue suffering the impacts. And then also studies say that women, boys, and girls are 14 times more likely to die during disasters more than men. So we can see that this really impacts are unevenly distributed across the board. Next. Looking at the gendered impacts of climate change, we also note that as much as the previous speakers have talked about the different carbon footprints for men and women, the impacts are also different based on the roles, like has been mentioned before. So we realize that the impacts are not gender neutral. Women, men, women, children, minorities, indigenous people, they're all these intersectionalities. They have different needs, different priorities, different possibilities in contributing to adaptation and mitigation. And most of the studies show that the impacts are higher for women, which is highly researched. And when we look at the implications again across the different areas where men and women engage, when we look at agriculture, if there's crop failure, then the increased workload, we see men moving out of households, selling their labor or migrating to other places. We see nutrition and morbidity related deaths. And when energy needs increase, then we see women spending more time on collecting fuel wood. We see households experiencing high expenses, cases of assault for women and girls, which comes also with the water scarcity. We see issues of waterborne diseases. And of course, we looked at the statistics on natural disasters. And again, the caregiving roles that women engage in, the health expenses, most times which are controlled by men and making decisions. And largely, we see cases of gender-based violence also erupting out of some of these implications. But then most of the research analyzes the impacts from the women's perspective. It is true that they're experiencing these impacts greatly more than the men. The men's carbon footprint is higher due to what they are doing, but there's a gap in research on looking at how men are affected by climate change. There are fewer studies that are really focusing on that. And there are implications for men, but bigger implications for women when we fail to understand how men are also impacted by climate change. A study that has been done on men, masculinities, and climate change. And in IID, we've also done a study with the Embassy of Ireland to try to understand the nexus between health, climate change, and health services. The findings are similar across. This study was done in South Africa, Australia, Peru, and Greenland. And the findings are almost similar to what we found in Tanzania, is that the males, we're looking at the masculinities. When we look at the male gendered norms of masculinity, power, and privilege, and the loss of income that comes in as a result of climate change, it leads to change in traditional gender roles, and men start relying on women's income or they can't provide. So that leads to psychological impacts. And this has been presented through high alcohol consumption by men or violence against women and children. Sometimes men migrate for work. And what this means is that the feminization of responsibility increases for women because they remain behind to take care of the household, the education of the children, the health needs, because the men have stepped away. And the helplessness and low self-esteem due to failure to provide and poverty against all the power and dominance that men are used to is what results into the violence against women and children. And we're also told in that study, the men usually do not seek help when they have problems. And this has increased men's mental health problems. Even this study in the 5 countries found that out, and men attested to us in the focus group discussions. And they mentioned cases of suicide where men are not able to cope. So most of the time when we're doing vulnerability assessments on the impacts of climate on the different sections of community, somehow we don't use methods that try to capture information from men and learn how they cope and how they can also be meaningfully involved in these processes so that the workload for women reduces, so that they're able to contribute. Because not including them actually ends up more detrimental for the women than it would if we just worked with all of them. And there's also a narrative around women being victims. Her Excellency, the Minister, mentioned this well and said women are not just victims, they are also contributing. So we need to build more on the role of women, the positive role of women, than looking at them as vulnerable and helpless and needing support, but build more and increase their capacities and agency, because they have lots of knowledge on water systems and the environment, traditional indigenous knowledge on weather systems, food security, and others. And we know from the studies that they've taken on more responsibility from the men. So how do we get the men to get engaged in climate adaptation and support these roles? But then we also need to take into account the ways masculinities and patriarchy can have negative effects on gender in general, and try to deconstruct the stereotypes. It's not about who is more powerful, it's about households working together to adapt to the changes that are being experienced. And then we also need to look at gender transformative approaches so that we're addressing structural issues of inequality and not just focusing on individual systems. That's where change is likely to happen. So as I conclude, just a few messages. One of them, we know that the impacts are disproportionate on men and women, but both are affected though differently, and the scales might be different, but it's important for us to understand how each group is affected. We need to deconstruct and transform the stereotypes on gender roles so that we're able to find effective climate change adaptation solutions. And we can use this space and this opportunity to address the structural inequalities as we do climate vulnerability assessments. Can we integrate gender analysis and try to find ways of engaging men in constructive ways so that the burden does not fall on the women? We also need to address the underlying causes of inequality, poverty, and vulnerability, because even before we started talking about climate change, these issues were challenges. Gender inequality has been there for years, but how do we support coherent programs and coherent analysis of issues so that there's contribution from different sources and we're able to sort of work together in a more integrated manner? And then in the assessments, we really need to understand on how each group is affected, not only gender, but the different intersectionalities where we find somebody may be a woman, but they're also minorities or indigenous people, they are also poor, which makes it a triple burden. So we really need to understand who are those that are likely to be left behind and make sure that adaptation efforts are focusing on everybody that is affected. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. I wish to bring some Indigenous perspective to this discussion and to this theme of women and men being differently affected by climate change. For Indigenous people, I feel like combating climate change almost happens backwards compared to everyone else, because even though globally societies are gradually moving towards renewable energy and whatnot, many Indigenous communities still face threats from polluting industries that are only just beginning to plunder Indigenous land. And so I'm glad that this conference was organized today, since there has been a very topical event in my homelands in the Arctic that I want to talk about. So for the Sami, women are completely essential to the survival of our culture. And so more often than not, it's the women that pass on the language and the family heritage. And so the Sami are traditionally a matriarchal society, despite us being westernized and colonized to do the opposite. So every time there is a crisis or a land rights dispute of any sort, despite having many responsibilities already, it's often the Sami women who take the lead in these fights. Just a few days ago, it was announced that a very large area of land in the Sami tundra has been reserved for a mining company to conduct research on whether they should build a mine there or not. And if that would happen, it would devastate the local Sami community completely and end reindeer herding for entire families and villages who depend on reindeer herding as a living. And the announcement came completely out of nowhere, and the community in question only had about a day to make their official complaints on the plans. And so what happened was that within just a few days, the local women, the local mothers, have made official complaints to the administrative court of Northern Finland. They've launched a protest campaign, and they brought together Samis from all over the country to get help and receive advice on what to do. And what's interesting to me is that the group that's helping them also consists almost entirely of women. And so every time a crisis like drilling or mining or mass tourism forcibly enters the fragile Arctic lands where Sami live, it's often the women and the mothers as the heads of the family that have to put our responsibilities on hold and protect the homes from outside intrusion. And so for Sami, it's not uncommon for women and mothers and girls to be completely burned out due to having too much on their hands. And so I'm very worried about Sami women and Indigenous women everywhere, because our responsibilities tend to double when there is a climate-related crisis like this. And it also affects our mental health and our well-being very negatively. And I think this is an important topic, and I think one of the key reasons why this is an overlooked effect of climate negative effects on Indigenous women is that we have too little research on the causes of stress for specifically women in indigenous communities. Because the climate crisis for indigenous people isn't only about the changes in nature in our traditional lands, but it's also about the constant stress of knowing that indigenous lands are the last resorts of biodiversity on Earth, and that everyone wants a piece of that. And so when no one else can or will do something, it has to be the Sami women in the community who stand up for their homes and their families. And so this is why I've started to pay attention to any forum where climate issues are discussed, because if they don't include indigenous voices, the discussion and the information, I think, is incomplete, which then leads to decisions being made based on incomplete knowledge, which then affects indigenous communities in ways that the government isn't able to anticipate. But the communities might have foreseen if they were given the chance to say something in the first place. So with this comment, I want to encourage everyone to start paying attention to whether or not indigenous people have been included in a discussion, because if not, you will never know the whole story. Thank you.